She arrived in Silver Creek with 43 cents, a worn-out suitcase, and the name of a dead man. The uncle she had crossed an entire continent to find had been buried 6 days before her boots touched the dirt of that street. 6 days. The grave was still fresh. The flowers people left were already turning brown. Adeline Carter stood at that headstone in the cold October wind and understood, for the first time in her 24 years on this earth, what it meant to have absolutely nothing left. No money, no family, no way back. And somewhere behind her, a town full of strangers who didn't care either way. What? If this story moves you, hit that like button, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next will show you exactly what a person is capable of when they have nothing left to lose. The stagecoach pulled into Silver Creek just past 4 in the afternoon, when the light was already going thin and the mountains behind the town had swallowed most of the sky. Adeline Carter stepped down from the coach with her suitcase in one hand and her composure held together by nothing more than stubbornness and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from traveling 11 days with people who smelled like wet wool and spoke too loud about nothing important. She had been awake since before dawn. Her back ached from the wooden bench. The bread she'd eaten at the last stop had been stale enough to crack a tooth. None of that mattered. She was here. Silver Creek was not what she had imagined when her uncle's letter described it. She had pictured something modest but hopeful. The kind of small western town that looked rough around the edges but had good bones underneath. What she found instead was a main street cut deep with wagon ruts, a string of storefronts that leaned slightly like men who had been drinking since noon, and a sky so wide and indifferent above it all that it made her feel approximately the size of a shirt button. But she had made it. After everything. After her mother's illness, after the funeral, after watching the last familiar house in Philadelphia disappear behind her as she boarded the first of 4 trains, she had made it to Silver Creek, to her Uncle Harold, to the only family she had left in this world. She asked the man unloading luggage where she might find Harold Whitmore. The man paused, straightened up, gave her a look that people give when they already know something you don't, and they're trying to decide how to deliver it. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this. Harold Whitmore passed 6 days ago. Heart gave out while he was fixing a fence post. Wasn't anyone around when it happened." Adeline stood very still. The man kept talking, said something about the church, said something about the neighbors who had tried to find if Harold had any family to notify, said he was real sorry. But the words were reaching her from somewhere far away, like voices through a closed door. She heard them. She just couldn't quite put them where they belonged. 6 days, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Yes." She nodded once, thanked him, picked up her suitcase and walked to the edge of the platform where she stood looking down at the main street below and thought, with remarkable clarity, well, that's it then. She found the grave that afternoon before the light completely failed. The cemetery sat at the western edge of town, enclosed by a low fence that a determined wind could probably have knocked over. Most of the headstones were simple, names and dates carved into local stone, nothing more. Harold's was the freshest. The mound of earth was still dark and unsettled, and someone had left a small bunch of dried wildflowers that had since turned brittle in the cold. Adeline set her suitcase down and stood there for a long time. She had not known her uncle particularly well. He had left Pennsylvania before she was born, and their relationship had been maintained almost entirely through letters. His handwriting large and slanted, hers careful and neat, back and forth across a distance that had always felt too great to cross until now. He had written to her after her mother died. "Come west," he had said. "There's nothing keeping you there. Come out here and start fresh. I've got room, and I've got enough work to keep us both busy." She had sold nearly everything she owned to afford the journey. The furniture, her mother's good china, the small gold brooch that had been a birthday gift years ago from a man whose face she was already forgetting. The 43 cents in her coat pocket was what remained after train fare, 2 meals, and a night in a boarding house in Kansas City where the walls were so thin she could hear the couple arguing in the next room until 2 in the morning. She looked at Harold's headstone, felt nothing yet. The grief would come later, she suspected, when she was less tired and more alone. Right now there was only the cold and the enormous, pressing problem of what happened next. She was 24 years old. She was in a town where she knew not one single human being. She had 43 cents. Winter was coming. She could feel it already in the way the wind cut through her coat, which was not nearly heavy enough for this altitude. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner," she said to the headstone. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I think we would have gotten along well." She picked up her suitcase and walked back into town. The Halverson Hotel was the cheaper of Silver Creek's 2 boarding establishments, which is why Adeline went there first. The woman at the front desk, a Mrs. Halverson, presumably, was broad-shouldered and practical-looking, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything people brought through her door sometime around 1870. "Room's $2 a week," Mrs. Halverson said. "Includes breakfast, supper's extra." "I can pay for 3 nights right now," Adeline said. It was a lie. She had 43 cents. But she had learned in the past several months of difficult circumstances that sometimes you had to begin a negotiation from a position slightly stronger than your actual one. "I'll need to find work first. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, do laundry, keep accounts." "Where are you coming from?" "Philadelphia." Mrs. Halverson studied her for a moment, looked at the suitcase, looked at her coat, which was city-made and clearly inadequate. "You got family here?" "I did," Adeline said. "Harold Whitmore was my uncle." Something shifted slightly in Mrs. Halverson's expression. "I heard about Harold. Good man. Kept to himself, but good." A pause. "You just got in on the stage?" "Yes, ma'am." Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Halverson appeared to be doing some kind of internal calculation, the kind that involved more than just money. "I'll put you in room 4, she said finally. "We'll talk about what you owe me once you've found work, but I expect you to be serious about finding it. I'm not running a charity." "I'm absolutely serious," Adeline said. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." She meant it. There was not a single alternative available to her that did not involve sleeping outdoors in October in the Colorado mountains, and so the word serious did not even begin to cover it. What? Room 4 was small. The window looked out onto the alley between the hotel and the hardware store next door. There was a bed, a washstand, a small wood stove that took her 3 tries to light correctly, and a mirror above the washstand that showed her, in the failing evening light, a face she barely recognized, hollowed out with tiredness, pale in a way that had nothing to do with cold, eyes that looked like they were working very hard at something that didn't show. She sat on the edge of the bed and permitted herself exactly 5 minutes of being completely undone. Not crying. She was too tired for proper crying. Just sitting with her hands in her lap and feeling the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten here and how very, very far she had come from anything resembling solid ground. When the 5 minutes were done, she stood up, straightened her skirt, washed her face with the cold water in the basin, and began to make a list in her head. Find work. That was first. Find work before Mrs. Halverson's patience ran out. Then, food. The breakfast included with the room would carry her through tomorrow morning. She needed to be employed before noon. After that, she could worry about everything else. She lay down on the narrow bed without undressing and was asleep before the wood stove had properly warmed the room. She started at the north end of Main Street the next morning and worked her way south. The general store. Not hiring. The restaurant. Full up. Sorry. The seamstress on the corner. Too busy already. The doctor's office. No, and also slightly affronted that she'd asked. She tried the hotel kitchen and was told Mrs. Halverson handled that herself. She tried the schoolhouse on the hill and was told the teacher position was filled. She asked at the feed and grain. The man behind the counter actually laughed before he caught himself. By 11 o'clock, she was running out of street. By noon, she had reached the south end and turned around and stood looking back at the entire length of Silver Creek with the particular feeling of someone who has just walked the full perimeter of a cage and confirmed there is no door. It was at the laundry that she finally found something. The place was called, simply and accurately, the Silver Creek Laundry, and it occupied a long, low building near the edge of town where the steam from the washing tubs could drift off without bothering anyone. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Pedig, and she was small and ferocious in the way that only people who have done hard physical labor their entire lives manage to be. Compact and direct, with forearms like a blacksmith and a gaze that went straight to the point. "I don't pay much," Mrs. Pedig said, "and the work is hard. Your hands will be wrecked inside a week." I understand. You ever worked a laundry before? No, but I learned quickly, and I can work long hours without complaint. Everyone says that. Mrs. Pettig looked at her steadily. Most people can't. I can. 50 cents a day, 6 days a week. You start at 6 in the morning and you go until it's done. 50 cents a day was not very much. It was something, though. It was more than 43 cents, which was currently everything she had. When can I start? Adeline asked. Tomorrow, Mrs. Pettig said, already turning away. Don't be late. She was not late. She arrived at 5 minutes to 6 while the sky was still more dark than light, and she worked until the muscles in her shoulders were screaming and her hands, already dry from the cold, had cracked in 2 places from the lye soap and hot water. She did not complain. She went back the next day, and the day after that. The work was honest, and it was brutal, and it was exactly the kind of thing she needed because it left her too tired at the end of each day to think very much about her situation. She could pay Mrs. Halverson, she could buy simple food, she could sleep. That was enough, for now. That was the structure she was building her survival around. Silver Creek was watching her. She was aware of that. A strange woman appearing from nowhere, working the laundry, clearly educated and clearly out of place. People noticed. She heard the speculation occasionally, fragments of it drifting past her while she walked the street or waited in the general store. Harold Whitmore's niece, all the way from Philadelphia. Poor thing. She kept her head up and her expression neutral and let them say whatever they needed to. It was on the 5th day, a Saturday, that she met the children. She had gone to the general store after work to buy flour and a small amount of salt pork, the cheapest things she could find that would actually sustain her. And she was counting out her coins at the counter with the careful focus of someone performing arithmetic that genuinely matters, when she became aware that she was being stared at. She looked up. 2 children stood a few feet away, watching her with the frank, unblinking attention that children apparently feel no need to disguise. The older one was a boy, maybe 8 or 9, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were too sharp and observant for his age. The younger was a girl, perhaps 5 or 6, holding a small cloth doll by one arm and studying Adeline with solemn curiosity. You were counting your money wrong, the boy said. Adeline blinked. I beg your pardon? You had one of those, he pointed at a coin, in the wrong pile. It's a dime, not a penny. You almost gave yourself less change than you should have. She looked down at the coins. He was right. She had missed it. She had been more tired than she realized. Thank you, she said. She meant it genuinely. The boy shrugged in the way children shrug when they're trying to seem like it wasn't important, and it very obviously was. You're the new woman at the laundry. I am. Our pa brought shirts there last week. Did you wash them? I wash everything that comes through the door. He appeared to consider this. Are you sad? The question was so direct and so unexpected that she didn't have an immediate answer ready. Adults almost never asked that. Adults danced around it, gestured toward it, implied it, and then backed away. This child had just walked straight up and said it out loud. I've been better, she said finally. The boy nodded, as though this were a perfectly satisfactory answer. The girl had moved slightly closer in the way small children sometimes do. Not quite approaching, just reducing the distance, the way you might move toward a fire you're not sure about. Our ma died, the girl said suddenly. Her voice was matter of fact. She had the tone of someone who has said something difficult so many times that the words no longer tremble, even if the thing behind them still does. I'm very sorry, Adeline said. She said it the way you say it when you mean it and not when you're just filling silence. The girl gave a small nod, went back to looking at her doll. A voice came from the door. Eli, Clara. A man stepped into the store. He was tall, taller than she'd registered at first, the kind of tall that required a slight adjustment when your eyes were used to average, with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, and the kind of build that comes from actual physical work and not from any particular intention. He was wearing a coat that had been repaired at one sleeve and a hat that had been used hard. He looked at the 2 children with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and relief at finding them exactly where he'd expected. Then he looked at Adeline. Sorry, he said. I hope they weren't bothering you. Not at all. The boy actually saved me from undercounting my change. Something flickered in the man's expression. Surprise, maybe, or something softer than surprise. He looked at the boy, who had resumed his study of a jar of hard candy on the counter. "Eli," the man said. "She was going to give herself less money than she had coming," Eli said, still looking at the candy. "I just pointed it out." "He's right, and I'm grateful," Adeline said. She finished gathering her coins and tucked them away. "I'm Adeline Carter." "Colton Briggs?" He didn't offer his hand. She noticed that, the slight hesitation, as though the gesture had occurred to him and then been considered and set aside. "You're Harold Whitmore's niece." "Yes. I heard you'd come in on the stage." A pause. "I'm sorry about Harold. He was a decent man." "Thank you." Another pause. The kind that happens when two people are standing in a doorway of a conversation and neither one is quite sure whether to step through or politely retreat. The children had drifted together to look at the candy jar. The store owner was pretending to arrange something behind the counter. "I hope you find Silver Creek to be good to you," Colton Briggs said finally. It was a careful thing to say. Not quite a pleasantry, not quite meaningful, somewhere in the space between. "I expect it will," she said, "once I convince it to." He almost smiled. Just barely. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the beginning of a thing that didn't quite arrive. Then he nodded once, said the children's names again to get them moving, and they filed out of the store ahead of him like small ducks. Adeline watched them go. The girl, Clara, glanced back once from the doorway, still holding her doll, and gave Adeline a look that contained something she couldn't quite name. She picked up her groceries and walked back to the hotel. The meal arrived that same evening. She was in her room, had been sitting on the bed trying to calculate how many weeks until she might have enough saved to begin thinking about next steps, when a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Halverson holding a tray. "Someone left this for you," Mrs. Halverson said, with the tone of a woman communicating information without commentary. The tray held a covered plate, some kind of stew, still warm, with bread, and a small folded note tucked beneath it. She waited until Mrs. Halverson had gone before she opened the note. "There wasn't enough reason for you to go to bed hungry tonight. CB." She stood holding the note for a moment. Then she sat down with the tray in her lap and ate every bite of it, because she was starving and it was good and she had not had a warm meal in 3 days. But she thought about the note the whole time she was eating, the restraint of it, the careful way it was worded. There wasn't enough reason. Not, "I wanted to help." Not, "I felt sorry for you." Just a quiet, sideways acknowledgement that the situation was what it was, and that food was simply food, and that no one needed to make it into anything more than that. It was the most dignified form of generosity she had ever received. She did not sleep easily that night, though she was tired enough to. She lay on the narrow bed listening to the wind against the window and the occasional sound of the street below. Boots on the boardwalk, a door somewhere, a horse, and thought about where she was and how she had gotten here and what the weeks ahead were going to require of her. She was not without resources. That was what she kept coming back to. She had no money and no connections and no family left. But she had a mind that worked, hands that could be made to do whatever was needed, and the particular, hard-edged kind of determination that comes from having already done the thing everyone thought was impossible. She had gotten here, to Silver Creek, across the entire country, on almost nothing. Getting from here to something better was just more of the same. She turned on her side and looked at the wall and made herself breathe slowly and deliberately, which was a trick she had learned from her mother. When everything feels like falling, at least breathe like you're standing. And after a while, the noise of the street below and the wind against the glass became a kind of company, and she slept. November settled in with the particular coldness of high-altitude places. Not dramatic, just total. The cold was everywhere, all the time, a fact of life like the mountains themselves. The laundry steam became the warmest place Adeline spent most of her day, and she started arriving even earlier than required so that she could thaw her hands before the first wash of the morning. Mrs. Pedig noticed without saying anything about it. One morning she simply moved Adeline's station closer to the main heating stove without explanation, and Adeline moved with it and didn't mention it, and that was how they communicated. She was learning the shape of things. The town had its rhythms, its patterns, its hierarchies, who mattered and who didn't and who thought they did. The Halverson Hotel was respectable but not fashionable. The church was the real center of the social order, though Adeline kept her attendance occasional and her head down. The wealthy end of Silver Creek, and there was one, tucked away on the north side where the houses were larger and the fences were painted, operated on a different set of rules than the south end where she lived and worked. She was aware of Colton Briggs in the way you become aware of someone who has done something unexpected for you. A peripheral awareness, a noticing. She saw him occasionally, in the street, in the store, once at the post office. They exchanged brief acknowledgments in the way of people who have had one real moment of connection and are both slightly uncertain what to do with it. He was always with one or both children, or clearly just arrived from the ranch. There was mud on his boots or hay on his coat, the evidence of a man who had more work than daylight. She heard things about him because Silver Creek was a town that talked. His wife had died 2 years ago. Fever, sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to arrange your feelings before it's over. He had been running the ranch alone since then, with help from a hired man and the children helping where children could. People described him as quiet, reliable, fair, not given to socializing. Nobody seemed to have a bad word to say about him, which in a town this size was either genuinely meaningful or an indication that no one knew him well enough to say anything at all. The Briggs children, meanwhile, appeared to have adopted her. She didn't plan for it to happen. It started gradually. She would pass them on the street, and Eli would have a question about something he'd been thinking about, a mathematical thing, or a question about what Philadelphia looked like, or once, memorably, whether she thought a dog could learn to understand more words than it let on. She would answer, and Clara would listen, and then they would move on. Then one afternoon, Eli appeared at the laundry door, which was not done. It was clearly a working place, to tell her that his sister had left her favorite doll somewhere on the walk between the general store and the hotel, and he thought she might have dropped it near the laundry if she was going to help, which she didn't have to. She found the doll. It was in the mud near the side of the building, half hidden under the boardwalk overhang. She cleaned it up as best she could, brought it to the hotel where she knew the children sometimes waited for their father when he had errands on that end of town, and gave it back to Clara, who hugged it and then looked up at Adeline with those two solemn eyes. "Thank you," Clara said. "Of course. Pa says you're very hard-working." Adeline blinked. "Does he?" "He said it to Mr. Alcott at the feed store. I heard him." Clara regarded her doll. "He doesn't say that about many people." Acham. It was Eli who first brought Colton Briggs directly into the situation, because Eli was 8 years old and felt no obligation to manage situations indirectly. They were all in the general store, Adeline doing her weekly shopping, the children waiting for their father who was at the counter settling an account, when Eli appeared at her elbow with the look of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. "You should come to dinner," he said. "Eli." His father's voice came from across the store, carrying a distinct note of warning. "It makes sense," Eli continued, ignoring the warning with the complete confidence of a child who has thought about something and found it logical. "You're always by yourself, and the food at the hotel is bad. We have enough food. Clara likes you. Pa cooks better than people think. Eli." Colton Briggs was now standing behind his son with an expression that was somewhere between mortification and resignation. "It's practical," Eli said. "You don't invite people to dinner without asking," his father said firmly. "I'm asking now." Adeline looked from the boy to the man. Colton Briggs was looking at her with an expression that was impossible to read, embarrassed by his son clearly, but also something else underneath that, a kind of cautious waiting. "I don't want to impose," she said. "You're not imposing," Eli said immediately. "Eli." The father's voice was quieter now. "Miss Carter can decide for herself." She looked at Colton Briggs directly then. He met her eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it was the most honest exchange they'd had since the note on the tray. "Next Sunday, if you're willing," he said finally. "It's nothing formal, just a meal." "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you." She walked to the Briggs Ranch on Sunday afternoon with her coat buttoned to her chin and her best pair of gloves, which were still not warm enough. The ranch was about a mile outside of town, a straightforward walk along the road that followed the creek, with the mountains getting larger and more serious the further you went. The place was... She searched for the word as she walked the last stretch of the drive toward the house. Sturdy. That was the word. Not prosperous. She could see the evidence of a stretch of hard years in the fencing that needed repair and the outbuildings that had a slightly weathered look, as though maintenance had been postponed repeatedly in favor of more urgent things. But the main house was solid and well situated, and the land around it had the feel of something that had been genuinely worked and genuinely cared for, which was different from land that had simply been used. The children spotted her from the window before she reached the porch. Clara had the door open before she knocked. "You came," she said, with a gravity that suggested she had not been entirely certain. "I said I would." "Eli said you definitely would, and I said probably." Eli was right this time. Clara considered this. "He usually is. It's annoying." Colton was in the kitchen, which became apparent from the sounds and smells. Something in a pot that involved onions and some kind of meat, bread that had already been baked and was staying warm. He appeared in the doorway wiping his hands on a cloth, and the kitchen behind him was the realest thing she had seen in weeks. Actual mess, actual warmth, the evidence of cooking done by someone who was doing their best in imperfect conditions. "You found it all right," he said. "The road's straight forward. Come in, it won't be long." She came in. The dinner table was plain wood, not formal at all. A working table, flowers still visible in the grain if you looked. The chairs didn't match. There was a crack in the window above the kitchen sink that had been patched with something and was holding. These were the details she noticed, not as evidence of failure, but as evidence of a life being lived as honestly as possible with what was available. They ate. The food was good, genuinely good, simple, but well-seasoned, the kind of cooking that comes from necessity and repetition rather than any formal instruction. Eli talked more or less continuously throughout the meal, a running commentary on ranch life and school, and a mathematical puzzle he'd been trying to solve, and an extremely lengthy and involved question about whether horses could tell time by some internal mechanism he'd been developing a theory about. Clara ate in her careful, quiet way, offering occasional observations that were always 3 times more perceptive than you expected. Colton Briggs said relatively little. He answered questions when they were addressed to him. He made sure plates were full. He cut Clara's bread for her without being asked. He watched his children the way a man watches something he values, without being entirely sure how to protect it. Once, just once, he looked at Adeline across the table while Eli was mid-theory about horses. And the look said nothing specific, but it said it very clearly. She helped with the dishes after, despite his protest that she didn't need to. She simply picked up a dish and started drying it, and he eventually accepted this and handed her another. "Your children are remarkable," she said. "They are," he said. Simple. No modesty about it, because there was no reason for it. "Eli has his mother's directness," she said, and then caught herself because she hadn't meant to assume, but he just nodded. "He does. She never went around anything when she could go through it." A pause. "Clara has it too, but she's more patient about it. She watches everything. Always has." He handed her another dish. "Even when she was a baby. Watching." They worked quietly for a moment. "Thank you for the meal on my first night," she said. "I meant to say something earlier." "It was nothing." "It wasn't," she said. "It was a very precise form of kindness. I want you to know I recognize that." He didn't answer immediately, just kept washing. Then, "You looked like someone who needed feeding and had too much pride to show it." Both of those things were true. I figured. She finished the last dish and set it in the stack and looked at the cracked window and the repaired fence visible through it in the last of the afternoon light. A hard place, this. A place that asked a lot of the people who stayed in it. "It's a good ranch," she said. "It will be again," he said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not hopeful exactly. Not defeated either. Just a statement of intent from someone who has measured the distance to where he needs to go and decided to start walking. She put on her coat and gloves to leave, and Clara pressed the cloth doll into her hands at the door. "She wants you to hold her on the way home," Clara said. "So you're not by yourself." Adeline looked at the doll, looked at Clara. "I'll bring her back next time I see you," she said. She walked back to town with the small doll tucked under her arm, and the mountains going dark ahead of her and the cold coming down out of the sky, and she thought about a cracked window and unmatched chairs and a man who cooked dinner for his children every night and said it will be again, like it was simply a fact he hadn't gotten around to yet. She thought about that the whole way back to the hotel. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep in room 4, with the wood stove ticking quietly and the wind outside doing whatever it wanted. And somewhere on the road back to Silver Creek, for the first time since she'd arrived in this territory, the tight thing in her chest loosened, just slightly, just enough, and let her breathe a little deeper than she had in weeks. She had come to Silver Creek with 43 cents and the name of a dead man. She had found, instead, a town that was waiting to see what she was made of, 2 children who had decided that question was already settled, and a quiet man who cooked dinner and fixed fences and said things like, "It will be again," as though the future was simply a problem he hadn't finished solving yet. The winter was just beginning, and so, it turned out, was everything else. December arrived the way it always does in mountain country. Not all at once, but in layers, each one colder and more certain than the last. Until one morning you wake up and the ground is frozen solid, and you understand that this is simply how things are going to be for a while, and there is no point arguing with it. Adeline had been in Silver Creek for 6 weeks. Her hands had healed in the cracks, and then cracked again, and then healed again. A cycle she had accepted as simply the price of the work. She knew the laundry's rhythms now. Which tubs ran hottest, which hours were worst for steam in the eyes, which customers needed their things back by certain days and would make everyone's life difficult if that didn't happen. Mrs. Pettig had raised her pay by a nickel a day without explanation, setting the coins on the edge of the washboard one morning and walking away before Adeline could respond. She chose to understand this as approval. She had been back to the Briggs Ranch twice more since that first Sunday dinner, both times invited by Eli, who had appointed himself some kind of social coordinator with the confidence of a person who sees no obstacle in that arrangement. The second time she helped Clara with the letters she was supposed to be practicing for school, sitting at the kitchen table while Colton worked outside in the cold and came in afterward with reddened hands and said almost nothing through supper, but listened to everything. The third time Eli had a question about long division that had apparently become a personal matter between him and the problem, and she worked through it with him for the better part of an hour while Clara sat nearby drawing something in a small notebook she kept close. The children were easier for her than their father, in the way that children often are. They wanted simple things. They said what they meant. They did not require her to navigate the complex silences that adults create around things they're not sure how to approach. Colton Briggs was courteous, and she was beginning to understand that his courtesy was genuine and not a wall. But it was still a form of distance, and she did not push against it. She had her own forms of distance. She understood the function. What she did not expect was the town to start paying attention in a way that had an opinion attached. It started small. A look held a beat too long at the general store. A comment she half heard and half didn't while picking up her wages from the laundry's front desk. Mrs. Halverson said nothing directly, but had a way of looking slightly to the left of whatever she was saying that communicated something sideways. Silver Creek was a small place, and small places ran on information the way machines ran on fuel. The moment something interesting appeared, it was processed quickly and thoroughly and sorted into categories that everyone could agree on. The category they were sorting her and Colton Briggs into was one she hadn't invited and wasn't certain what to do with. "People are talking," Mrs. Pettig told her one morning, not looking up from the shirt she was working on. This was also her way, communicating while doing something else. So the weight of the thing had somewhere to go besides directly between the two of them. "I expect they are," Adeline said. "Not badly. Mostly curious." A pause. "Some of them think Colton Briggs wouldn't know what to do with a woman showing interest, even if she walked up and told him to his face." "I'm not showing interest," Adeline said. "I'm having dinner with his family occasionally." The shirt got particularly thorough attention for a moment. "You know, Margaret Fowler has been angling for his attention for the better part of a year." Adeline didn't know who Margaret Fowler was, but she stored the information. "Then I hope she catches it," she said, and went back to work. She meant it, mostly. Or she told herself she meant it, which was close enough for the time being. She met Edmund Hale on a Tuesday. He came into the laundry to collect a set of tablecloths. He owned the Silver Creek Merchant and Supply, the largest store on the north end of Main Street, and he was the kind of man whose self-presentation left nothing to chance. Well-dressed, not ostentatiously, but with the deliberate care of someone who understood clothes as a form of communication. His hair was always arranged. His boots were good. He was perhaps 40, with a square jaw and the manner of a man who was accustomed to being found reasonable. He picked up his tablecloths, paid his bill, and then paused at the door. "You're Harold Whitmore's niece," he said. "I am," she said, because this was apparently how all conversations began in Silver Creek. "Edmund Hale." He said it like he expected the name to land with some weight, and she supposed it probably did for most people. "I was sorry to hear about Harold. He had an account with my store for years, always paid on time." "That sounds like him," she said, though she had no actual basis for saying it. "You've been working here a couple of months now," he said. "You must be finding things somewhat difficult." "I find them manageable." "That's an admirable way to frame it." He smiled, and it was a practiced smile. Not insincere exactly, but assembled. "I wonder if you might consider something. I'm looking for someone to keep accounts at the store. The work is cleaner than this." A brief gesture at the laundry around them, tactful but honest. "And the pay is considerably better. You'd also be working in a warm building." She looked at him steadily. "What makes you think I can keep accounts?" "The way you counted those coins back in November at the general store and then corrected yourself. I was at the counter. I noticed." He said this simply, as though noticing things about people was just something he did, which was probably true. "Also, Mrs. Halverson mentioned you kept the accounts at your boarding situation back in Philadelphia." She made a note to have a conversation with Mrs. Halverson about what constituted private information. "I'll think about it," she said. "Please do." He picked up his package. "I also believe the social options in this town are somewhat limited for someone of your background. I host a small dinner at my house every few weeks. Some of the town's more established residents. I'd like you to attend, if you're willing." It was smoothly done. The job offer and the social invitation together, each one making the other seem more reasonable. She recognized the construction of it. "I'll think about both," she said. He nodded, satisfied in the way that people are when they believe a yes is already in motion. She watched him walk out into the cold street and stood for a moment considering what had just happened. Then she went back to the laundry and thought about warm buildings and better pay and what things cost eventually when someone else is the one offering them to you. She told no one about the conversation. But as December deepened and the cold became the kind of serious that makes every decision feel more urgent, she found herself thinking about it with increasing frequency. 55 cents a day kept her in the hotel room and fed, and nothing else. She had managed to put away a small amount. Not enough to call savings, enough perhaps to call a beginning, but her situation remained exactly one bad week away from the kind of trouble she couldn't afford. A sickness, a broken boot, a week when the laundry was slow. Any of it could undo the thin margin she'd built. Edmund Hale's offer was real. She had asked Mrs. Pettig, carefully and without explaining why, what she knew about him, and Mrs. Pettig had said, well off, widowed about 3 years ago, ran a clean business, not known to be dishonest, not known to be particularly generous either. He likes things orderly, Mrs. Pettig had said, and he likes things his way. She carried that last part around with her for a while. It was Colton's son who finally made her say something out loud about any of it, because Eli had a talent for asking questions that backed you into corners you hadn't intended to enter. They were in the ranch kitchen. She had come to help Clara with reading, which had become a loosely regular arrangement. And Eli was supposedly doing his own schoolwork at the other end of the table, but was clearly listening to everything while performing deep engagement with his arithmetic. "Do you like Mr. Hale?" he asked, out of nowhere, without looking up from his numbers. She looked at him. "I don't know him well enough to say." "He came to the laundry twice. People said he was talking to you." "People said." Mrs. Alcott told Mrs. Garrett, who told Mrs. Halverson, who, "I understand the chain of communication, Eli." "So do you?" He looked up now. "Like him." "He seems like a capable businessman," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Clara next to her continued to sound out words from the reader page in front of her with the serene focus of someone who is staying deliberately out of this conversation. "Eli," she said, "what exactly are you trying to ask me?" He considered this with the directness that was apparently just a feature of how he was built. "Pa doesn't talk about it, but he notices things. I can tell." He picked up his pencil again. He noticed when you wore your hair different last week. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. She didn't have an answer to that. She sat with it, which seemed to be the only honest thing to do. Your father and I are friends, she said at last. He's been very kind to me, and so have you and your sister, and I'm grateful for that. Eli looked at her for a long moment with those two old eyes. Okay, he said, and went back to his arithmetic in a way that made it very clear he had drawn his own conclusion and filed it away. She went to Edmund Hale's dinner. She told herself it was the reasonable thing to do. It was a social event, and she was a woman alone in a new place, and refusing to engage with the established community was a way of ensuring she remained on its margins indefinitely. She told herself she was simply gathering information. The house was on the north end of town. Large, well-maintained, the kind of house that existed to communicate stability. The dinner was 6 people: Hale, Adeline, the town's mayor and his wife, a prosperous rancher from up the valley named Whitfield, and a woman named Mrs. Durant who had the energy of someone elected to represent propriety generally. The food was good, the conversation was polished, and Edmund Hale was an attentive host in a way that was impossible to find fault with, and also impossible to entirely relax around. He remembered details from their brief conversations. He asked her opinion on things, and listened when she answered. He was, she realized, very deliberately trying to be impressive, and she couldn't decide whether the fact that he was doing it deliberately made it more or less genuine. After dinner, when the others had gone to the parlor, he handed her a glass of something warm and said, "I hope you'll consider the position at the store seriously. I've been considering it. It's a good offer, better than you'd get anywhere else in this town. I know, and I think—" He paused, choosing words with the care of a man who deals in transactions and knows that how you say something determines what you get for it. "I think Silver Creek has more to offer you than you may have realized when you arrived, under the right circumstances." She looked at him directly. "What circumstances are those?" He met her gaze. "Ones where you're not spending your days in a steam laundry, waiting for your situation to change on its own. You have more intelligence than your current position uses. That seems like a waste." It was flattery, but specific flattery, which was harder to dismiss. She turned the warm glass in her hands and looked at the fire in the grate. "I'll give you an answer about the position by the end of the week," she said. "And the rest?" "I haven't decided what there is to decide yet," she said honestly. He nodded, and something in his expression said that he heard this as progress, which perhaps it was. She finished her drink, said her goodbyes, and walked back to the hotel in the cold with her breath making small clouds in the dark air, thinking about what under the right circumstances was intended to mean and what it would cost her to find out. The next Sunday she went to the ranch, and things were different without anything changing. Or maybe she was different, she couldn't be certain. She helped Clara with the reading, as usual. Eli was outside with his father doing something involving a fence post that had failed, and she could hear them occasionally. Colton's low voice, Eli's higher one asking questions, the sound of work being done in the cold with no particular drama attached to it. Just 2 people fixing a thing that needed fixing. They came in for supper with cold, reddened faces and mud on their boots, and Eli went to the basin to wash his hands with the focused energy of a child who has been outside doing something real and is now returning to indoor civilization. Colton washed up after him, and she noticed the hands. They were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, scarred in places, the knuckles slightly swollen in a way they probably weren't a few years ago, capable looking in a way that had nothing decorative about it. At the table, Eli announced without preamble, "Pa fixed the fence, but the post might go again if the ground stays frozen like this, and then we'll have to do it different." "Then we'll do it different," Colton said. "It would be easier with 2 people who know what they're doing. One's faster than 2 when one doesn't know." "You're learning." "I'm slow at learning." "You're 8, Colton said. "You've got time." Clara looked up from her plate. "Adeline went to Mr. Hale's dinner," she said, with the serene accuracy of a child who has decided that all information is equally worth surfacing. The table went briefly quiet. Eli looked at his sister with an expression of moderate betrayal. Colton picked up his fork. "Is that so?" he said. Not a question, not a judgment, just the flattest possible acknowledgement. "It was a social occasion," Adeline said, and heard how it sounded and didn't know how to improve it. He's nice, Clara said thoughtfully. He gave Eli a peppermint once. One peppermint, Eli said. It wasn't significant. Colton said nothing else. He ate. He answered Eli's subsequent question about fence post anchoring in frozen ground with the patient detail of someone who has thought about this problem. He looked at Adeline once during the conversation, a look that she couldn't read and that was gone before she could try. She helped with the dishes again, as had become the habit. The children were in the other room, Clara putting her doll to bed with the elaborate ritual that apparently governed that process, Eli lying on the rug reading something by the lamp. "You're thinking about taking his offer," Colton said. He was handing her a dish, and he said it the way you say something when you've been deciding whether to say it for long enough that the deciding becomes too much. "I'm considering it," she said. "It's a good position, better money than the laundry." "Yes." "He'd be fair to you at the store." A pause. A dish passed between them. "I can't say the same about everything else." She looked at him then. "What do you mean by that?" He was quiet for a moment, running the cloth over a pot that didn't particularly need it. "Hale's a man who thinks in terms of what things cost and what they're worth. He sees that you're—" He stopped, started again. "He can see that you're more than your circumstances, which is true, but that's not entirely why he's paying attention." "I'm aware of that," she said. "I know you are." He set the pot down. "I'm not saying it because I think you haven't figured it out." "Then why are you saying it?" He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the distant sound of Eli turning a page. "I'm not sure," he said, and she believed him, because a man who was trying to manage a situation would have had a better answer than that. She dried the last dish, put it with the others, stood for a moment looking at the cracked window, which had ice on the outside corners now. "He wants to take care of me," she said. "Edmund Hale. That's the sum of it." "I expect so. I've been taken care of before, and it never quite goes the way the person offering it intends." She picked up her coat from the hook. "I'd rather build something than be handed it, even if what I'm building is slow and difficult." Colton didn't say anything, but he looked at her with an expression that had something in it she hadn't seen in him before, not quite recognition, but close to it. The look of someone who has heard a thing that resonates somewhere they weren't expecting. She said goodbye to the children. Clara insisted on pressing the doll into her hands again, which had become its own kind of ritual, and walked back out into the cold. The road to town was dark, and the stars were thick overhead, and the way they get in high altitude, very bright and very far away. And she walked and thought about two different kinds of life being offered to her, and how neither one was what she'd come to Silver Creek looking for, which had been only family and some version of solid ground. She had found neither of those things. She had found instead a freezing laundry and a cold hotel room and 55 cents a day and two children who gave her a doll to hold so she wouldn't be by herself on the way home, and a man who said it will be again like he'd already decided. She did not know yet which direction she was going to walk, but she was becoming increasingly certain that the decision mattered more than she had let herself understand. The week she had promised Edmund Hale came to its end on a Friday. She had spent the whole of it in the laundry, working through the cold and the steam and the cracked knuckles, and she had thought about ledger books in a warm office, and she had thought about Claire's handwriting getting better one letter at a time, and she had thought about a man who said things directly when he finally said them at all, and she had reached no conclusion that felt entirely clean. On Friday evening, she went to the hotel and sat at the small table in her room and wrote 2 letters. The first to Edmund Hale, saying she was grateful for his offer of the position, but she needed more time before she could commit to it, and would he allow her another 2 weeks to decide. She sealed it and would deliver it in the morning. The second letter she wrote and then sat looking at for a while, and then folded and set it inside the cover of the small book she kept on the washstand. Her mother's book, one of the only things she'd carried across the country. It was not a letter for anyone else. It was a list, really, what she wanted, what she was afraid of, what she was beginning, against all her intentions, to hope for. She wrote those things down and then closed the book and put out the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the wind work against the window. Outside, Silver Creek went on being itself, small and cold and full of opinions about other people's lives. And somewhere a mile down the frozen road, in a ranch house with an unmatched set of chairs, a man was presumably still fixing things that needed fixing and feeding his children and going to sleep with the weight of everything he was carrying and waking up to carry it again. She didn't know yet what any of it meant. She knew only that she hadn't left the letter inside the book because it didn't matter. She had left it there because it mattered too much to look at again tonight, and she was still learning how to want something without being terrified of how much she could lose if she was wrong. The 2 weeks she had asked Edmund Hale for passed the way winter weeks do in mountain country, slowly and with weight. January had settled in properly now, the kind of cold that didn't fluctuate but simply stayed, pressing down on everything with a patience that felt almost personal. The laundry was brutal in that weather. The water in the tubs went cold faster, the drying took longer, and the walk to work in the dark at 5:40 in the morning required a particular form of commitment that Adeline had not known she possessed until she was out there doing it every day. She kept her word to Mrs. Pedig. She kept her room at the Halverson. She kept her Sundays at the Briggs Ranch because the children expected her, and she had discovered somewhere over the course of the past 2 months that she expected it too. Hale was patient. That was the thing about him. He had the patience of a man who believed that time was on his side, because it usually had been. He came into the laundry once during those 2 weeks, collected his things, and said only, "I hope you're finding the time useful." She said she was. He nodded and left, and the restraint of it was its own form of pressure, which she was fairly certain he understood. What she had not anticipated was Colton Briggs doing something unexpected. He did it on a Sunday, and it wasn't dramatic. Nothing about him was dramatic. But it was the kind of thing that stays with you afterward and changes the shape of whatever was there before. She had arrived at the ranch at her usual time, mid-afternoon, and found Clara alone in the kitchen practicing her letters with the focused misery of a child who knows something is hard and has decided to do it anyway. Colton and Eli were outside, which was the normal state of things, but when Colton came in, earlier than usual, brushing cold from his coat, he looked at her with something slightly different in his face, like he had been thinking about something all morning and had reached a point. "I want to show you something," he said, "if you've got the time." Clara looked up from her letters. "I want to come." "Stay and finish the page," he said. Then to Adeline, "It's not far." She followed him outside. He led her around the back of the main house, past the outbuildings, to a stretch of the property she hadn't seen before, a long, flat area that ran along the south-facing side of the slope, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a natural rise in the land. In summer, she thought, the sun would hit this spot for most of the day. Right now it was frozen and bare, the earth hard underfoot, the remnants of something structural, posts sunk into the ground, the ghost of a fence, some kind of framing, poking up through the snow. This was a kitchen garden, Colton said. He said it simply, not building toward anything, just stating it. Ruth planted it the first spring we were here, expanded it every year after that. He looked at the frozen ground. After she died, I let it go, just didn't do anything with it. Eli tried to plant some things last spring on his own, but he didn't know what he was doing, and it didn't take. Adeline stood beside him, looking at the plot. She could see what it had been underneath the winter. The deliberate arrangement of it, the care of someone who knew what they were doing. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Out here away from the house, his voice was different, less careful somehow, as though the open air gave him permission. "Because I've been trying to figure out how to say something," he said, "and this seemed like the most honest way to start." He looked at her then, directly. "I'm not good at this. I want to be straight with you about that first." "At what?" "At—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck in the way he did when words were being difficult. "At saying what I mean. Ruth used to say I could fix anything on this ranch except a conversation." Pause. She wasn't wrong. Adeline waited. The wind moved over the frozen garden and lifted a thin line of snow from the surface and carried it sideways. "I know Hale is offering you something real," Colton said. "Better money, easier work, a kind of stability that—" He stopped again. "I'm not saying this right." "You're doing fine," she said. "Keep going." He looked at her. "I don't want you to make that choice because it's the only one that looks solid. That's what I'm trying to say." He gestured, slightly awkwardly, at the frozen plot between them. "This place has been half of what it should be for 2 years. I know that. I've been running it on the wrong side of enough for a while. And I told myself I was managing, and I was—" But only just. He looked back at the garden. I haven't let anyone in here, to the ranch, to any of it, and I'm not— A breath. I'm not asking you to fix what's broken. That's not what this is. What is it then? Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. It's me telling you that there's something real here, he said. Even with the busted fence and the garden that went to nothing and the fact that I'm not any easier to know than I was 2 years ago. He met her eyes and held them. I'm not Hale. I can't offer you what he can offer you, but I think you know that what he's offering and what I'm offering are not the same kind of thing, even if they look similar from a distance. The cold was significant. She could feel it in her fingers, even through her gloves. She stood with it for a moment, with the cold and the frozen ground and the ghost of someone else's garden and the man standing in it telling her something that was costing him a great deal to say. You're right that they're different, she said. Yeah, and you're right that I know the difference. He nodded once, looked away at the mountains. I just didn't want you to decide without knowing that He stopped. That this is a real place, whatever it looks like right now. She looked at the garden for a long time, at the posts still sunk in the frozen ground, holding their positions through 2 winters of being unattended, waiting for something, or no one, or both. Can anything grow here in spring? She asked. He looked at her sideways. Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, not quite hope, something more provisional than both. Yeah, he said. The soil's good. Always has been. She nodded. Didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and they stood there in the cold for another minute looking at the frozen garden that had once been something and had not yet decided what it was going to be next. Then they went back inside where Clara had finished exactly 2 of the 8 letters she was supposed to practice and was drawing a horse in the margin of the page, and Eli was demanding help with something he'd read in one of his father's almanacs, and the kitchen was warm, and the afternoon went on the way afternoons do when you are in a place that is trying, with all its imperfections and limitations and unfinished business, to become a home, it said. She gave Edmund Hale her answer the following Tuesday. He took it well, which she had expected. He was too composed a man to take things badly in the presence of witnesses, and they were at the front of his store with the door open to the street and 2 customers browsing the shelves in the back. He heard her say she wouldn't be taking the position, and something moved briefly across his face and was then organized away. I see, he said. I'm grateful for the offer. I mean that. Is there something about the terms? No, she said. The terms were generous. He studied her for a moment. He was perceptive. She had never doubted that about him. And she thought he understood more than she was saying. The Briggs Ranch, he said. Not accusing, just locating. I made a decision about my own situation, she said carefully. It wasn't about comparing. Of course. He straightened a small item on the counter. Colton Briggs is a decent man. Hard-working. A pause. He's also been alone for 2 years and shows very little sign of knowing what to do about it. That may be, she said, but that's not your concern or mine. No, he agreed. I suppose not. He looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, an expression of genuine regret. If your circumstances change, Miss Carter, the offer stands. Thank you, she said, and left the store. Outside, the street was its usual January self, cold, muddy in the wheel ruts where the sun hit for a few hours, busy with the particular commerce of a frontier town in winter. She walked south toward the laundry and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the better part of 10 days. The decision felt right. That was the thing she kept waiting to doubt and couldn't. It felt like the most solidly right thing she'd done since arriving in Silver Creek, and she was aware that it was not a practical decision. It was not the safe decision, or the secure one, or the one most likely to protect her from another 6 weeks like the first 6. And it was still the right one. She was becoming acquainted, slowly and reluctantly, with the particular terror of choosing things that were real over things that were simply reliable. Mrs. Pettig heard about it by the end of the day because news in Silver Creek traveled at the speed of weather. Everywhere, all at once, and there was no avoiding it. So you turned down the position, she said, in her way of saying things while looking at something else. I did. The something else received continued attention. People will have opinions. I expect they will. Margaret Fowler will be pleased, for one. Adeline had by now learned who Margaret Fowler was, a widow about 35, well regarded in town, who had been making her interest in Colton Briggs visible in the polite, deniable way of frontier society for the better part of a year. She was not a bad person, as far as Adeline could determine. She simply wanted something that Adeline was apparently standing in the way of, and she had begun to make this known through the series of small social maneuvers that women in small towns deploy when they want something and can't say so directly. Miss Fowler is welcome to whatever conclusion she draws, Adeline said. She told Mrs. Alcott that you've been taking advantage of a grieving widower's hospitality. Mrs. Pettig set down the thing she was looking at. I'm telling you this not because I believe it, but because you should know it's out there. Adeline stood with this. It was not the worst thing anyone had said about her. Her months in Philadelphia after her mother died had given her a thorough education in what people could manage when they were being cruel from a position of safety, but it landed differently here, in a place she was trying to build something. Thank you for telling me, she said. You know what you're doing, Mrs. Pettig said, which was the closest she ever came to encouragement. Just do it. What she had not anticipated was that the thing Colton had opened up in the garden would continue to open, slowly and irregularly, the way frozen ground thaws. Not all at once, but in patches, some parts releasing before others. The whole process messier and more uneven than you'd expect. He started talking to her differently. Not dramatically. Nothing with Colton Briggs was dramatic. But with a quality of directness that replaced the careful courtesy he'd maintained through the fall. He told her about the ranch's finances one Sunday evening, matter-of-factly, while Eli was reading and Clara was asleep. Told her the specific shape of where things stood, the debt he'd taken on when they'd had 2 bad seasons back-to-back, the note at the bank, the spring that would determine a great deal about the following winter. She listened without offering remedies she didn't have. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for it, he said. I know. I'm telling you because... He picked at a spot on the table's grain that didn't need attention. Because Ruth and I spent 2 years not talking about the hard things, and I always thought there would be time to do it differently, and then there wasn't. She didn't fill the silence that followed that. Some silences needed to be where they were. She didn't know how bad the second season was, he said finally. I thought I was protecting her from something. Mostly I wanted to be the kind of man who could handle things, and I couldn't handle it by myself and wouldn't say so. He looked up. I won't do that again, not with anyone. That's worth something, Adeline said. Figuring that out. It took me losing her to figure it out, he said. That's not something to be proud of. No, she agreed. But you figured it out anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I almost walked away the first day I saw you, at the general store. She blinked. What do you mean? Eli wanted to go over and say something to you, and I almost said no and kept walking. He looked at the table. I've been walking away from things for 2 years. Every time something came up that felt like it was going to require something from me, I wasn't sure I had. I just walked the other way. A pause. I turned back because I was tired of doing it. That's all. I saw him heading toward you and I just stopped walking away. She sat with that. The specific, unlikely smallness of it. One man stopping mid-step in a general store because he was tired of his own pattern. How much had rested on that? I'm glad you stopped, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, doll in hand, with the look of a child who has woken up and needs confirmation that the world is still in its expected configuration. You're still here, she said to Adeline. A statement, not quite a question. Still here, Adeline confirmed. Clara considered this and then went back to bed without further comment. And Colton watched her go with an expression that was not complicated. Just a man looking at his daughter, who had lost something enormous and was finding her way back in pieces, and being grateful for the pieces. The complication arrived in the second week of February, in the form of Margaret Fowler appearing at the laundry on a Wednesday morning under the pretext of picking up her washing, which Adeline had ready and waiting. She was a composed woman. Pleasant-faced, well-dressed for the season, with the manner of someone who has decided exactly how a conversation is going to go before it starts. I think you and I should speak plainly, Margaret said, while Adeline folded the paper around her bundle. All right, Adeline said. You've been spending a great deal of time at the Briggs Ranch. I have. Those children need stability, Margaret said. They need someone who is going to be there, not someone who is… She paused, choosing. Trying things out. Adeline tied the string around the bundle and set it on the counter. You're right that they need stability. Colton Briggs is not a complicated man, Margaret continued. He's a good man, and a tired one, and he needs someone who belongs in this town, who understands what this life is. You think I don't understand it? I think you came from Philadelphia 4 months ago, and you're still deciding whether you're staying. Margaret met her eyes directly. She had that much, at least. And I think it's not fair to those children to let them grow attached to someone who might decide Silver Creek isn't what she was hoping for. Adeline looked at her for a moment. She could see what this was, could see the genuine concern underneath the strategy, because Margaret Fowler was not simply maneuvering. She was also genuinely worried about 2 children she had known for 2 years, and that part was real. I understand why you're saying this, Adeline said, and I'm not going to tell you your concern is wrong. Margaret waited. But I'm not trying things out, Adeline said. I am staying. This is my decision, not because there's nothing else. I had another option and I turned it down. But because Silver Creek is where I'm planting myself, and that choice is made. You can say that now. I can say it because I mean it. She looked at Margaret steadily. I know you care about them. I think that's real, and I respect it. But I'm asking you to understand that I care about them too, and that is also real. The silence between them was the specific silence of 2 people who are not going to agree but have run out of terrain to argue over. Margaret picked up her bundle. I hope you mean it, she said. I know you do, Adeline said. I hope so too. She did not tell Colton about the conversation. She had learned enough about him to know that he would find it troubling in a way that would make him pull back slightly, the way a man does when he suspects he's become the center of a conflict and doesn't want to be, and she didn't want that. She handled it and moved forward, but it shook something loose that she hadn't quite admitted to herself yet. Margaret Fowler had named the thing. You're still deciding whether you're staying. It wasn't true. She was staying. But underneath the certainty was a layer of fear she had not fully looked at, because staying meant failing here if things went wrong. Staying meant going all the way in, with her name and her effort, and whatever remained of the hope she had carried across the country. Staying meant trusting that what she thought she saw in this place, in the frozen garden, in the unmatched chairs, in the man who turned back instead of walking away, was real and not just what she wanted to see because she was lonely and exhausted and needed it to be. She went to the ranch that Sunday, and something in her face must have been carrying the weight of the week, because Clara looked at her when she came in the door and said, without preamble, You look tired. I am a little. Eli gets that face when something is bothering him, but he doesn't want to say. It's the same face, Eli confirmed from across the room without looking up. I appreciate the comparison, Adeline said. Colton looked at her from the kitchen doorway. Just looked, without asking, in a way that said he noticed and would give her the room not to explain it. That was the moment she understood something. She had been waiting. She realized this now, sitting at the Briggs kitchen table with a cup of something warm around her cold fingers and Clara arranging her doll's hair very seriously beside her. She had been waiting for a reason to be afraid. Going through each thing systematically, holding it up to the light, and looking for the flaw, cataloging every reason to doubt. As though if she could find enough doubt, she'd be justified in the fear, and if she were justified in the fear, she'd be allowed to protect herself from it. But the doubt was not the point. The doubt was always going to be there. The question was what she was going to do with it. Colton set a plate in front of her. She hadn't asked, hadn't even mentioned being hungry, but he had apparently noticed something or simply decided, and the food was there. And she looked at the plate and then up at him and said very quietly, Thank you. It's just food, he said. It's never just food, she said. Not from you. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table and said, with the direct, slightly labored honesty that was his particular form of courage, I need to ask you something, and you can say no, and it won't change anything. All right. Springtime. When the ground thaws. He looked at the table. I'd like to rebuild the garden. Not, not by myself. He looked up. I'd like to know if you'd want to be part of that. The kitchen was warm. Eli had abandoned his pretense of not listening. Clara had stopped moving the doll's hair. Adeline looked at Colton Briggs, at his careful hands on the worn table and his face that didn't know how to hide what things cost him, and understood that he was not talking only about a garden, and he knew she knew that, and they had both arrived at the same place from entirely different directions. Yes, she said, simple, without ceremony. I'd like that. He nodded. Something in his shoulders settled. The particular release of a person who has been braced for an answer they've been dreading and received instead the one they'd only allowed themselves to want quietly. Clara leaned against Adeline's arm the way she had begun doing, gradually, incrementally, the way the frost thaw worked on frozen ground, not all at once. Eli turned back to his almanac and was very busy with it. The fire in the stove was uneven, as it always was. Sometimes it ran too hot and sometimes it barely drew, and Colton was always adjusting it. The window still had the crack in it, the chairs still didn't match, the debt at the bank was still real, and the spring was still uncertain, and there were still things between them that hadn't been said and would need to be and might be difficult when they got there. None of that had changed, but she was not measuring the distance to some better version of this anymore. She was sitting in it, right where it was, with its uneven fire and its honest imperfection, and she had finally stopped waiting to find a reason to leave. February gave way to March the way wounded things heal, unevenly, with setbacks, 2 warm days followed by a week of cold that felt personal. The mountains held their snow. The creek ran loud with the early melt and then quieted again when the temperature dropped. Silver Creek, the town, went on doing what small towns do in late winter, waiting. Adeline had stopped waiting. She was not sure exactly when the shift happened, not in one moment, she thought, but accumulated across many small ones. The frozen garden, the conversation at the table, the yes she had said without hesitation, and then carried home that night and examined from every angle, and found, to her own slight surprise, completely intact. She had woken the next morning and it was still there. She had worked a full week at the laundry and it was still there. That was how she knew it was real. Not that she felt no fear, but that the fear had stopped being the loudest thing. She told Mrs. Halverson first. Not intentionally, Mrs. Halverson had a way of asking questions that made telling her things feel inevitable. It was a Tuesday morning early, before work, and Adeline was in the small dining room with her breakfast, and Mrs. Halverson was refilling the coffee things and said, without particular setup, "You're going to marry that rancher." Adeline looked up from her cup. "He hasn't asked me." "He will." Mrs. Halverson set the pot down with the certainty of someone who has watched human beings long enough to read the signals at considerable distance. "When he does, you're going to say yes." "You seem very sure of that." "I've been running this hotel for 14 years. I know what someone looks like when they've made up their mind." She looked at Adeline directly. "You made yours up. Probably sometime around January." Adeline considered denying this and found she didn't particularly want to. "February," she said. Mrs. Halverson made a sound that might have been satisfaction. "Good. Those children have needed someone for a long time." "I'm not doing it for the children." "I know that. That's why it'll work." She picked up the coffee pot and moved toward the door, then paused. "He's a hard man to know. You understand that." "I'm beginning to." Ruth Briggs spent 3 years learning how he thought, and she was a patient woman. A pause. "I'm not saying it as a warning, just so you know what you're walking into." "I know what I'm walking into," Adeline said. And she did, or she knew as much as anyone can know a thing before they are fully inside it, which is the most honest form of knowing available. Colton asked her on a Saturday afternoon in the last week of March, which was not warm but had the quality of light that suggests warmth is intending to arrive eventually. He did not do it the way she might have imagined back in some earlier life when she'd had the leisure to imagine things like that. There was no particular staging. He had asked her to come to the ranch, just that, a simple request delivered when she ran into him at the post office. And when she arrived, the children were there but absorbed in their own occupations, and he met her at the fence rather than at the house. He had been working. She could tell. The mud on his boots, the way he took off his hat and pushed a hand through his hair in the slightly scattered way he did after a long stretch of physical effort. He had clearly not planned to do this today. That was perhaps why it came out the way it did. "I need to say something," he said. He was looking at the fence post rather than at her, which was his particular brand of honesty. He said hard things sideways sometimes, not because he was hiding, but because looking directly at something important made it harder for him to say it plainly. "All right," she said. "I've been trying to find the right time to do this, and I think I've been using that as a reason not to do it at all." He looked at her then. "So I'm just going to say it." She waited. "I would like you to be my wife," he said. It was plain and unornamented, and she understood that it had taken him a great deal to get there. "I know what I'm asking. I know this ranch is not easy and the money is not comfortable, and there's a banknote that needs 2 good seasons to clear, and 2 children who are—" He stopped. "Who are not always easy either, even though I know it doesn't look that way." "Eli is always easy," she said, "in that he's always exactly what he is." Something in his face shifted. "Yeah, that's accurate." "And Clara is working through things," he said. "She's been working through things since her mother died, and she's doing it in her own way, and she doesn't always let people see where she is with it." "I know," Adeline said. "I've been watching." He nodded, looked at the fence post again. "I don't have much to offer you that looks good on paper. I know what Hale offered you. I know this isn't that." "You don't need to compare." "I'm not comparing," he said. "I'm just—" He set his hat back on, took it off again. "I want you to know that I see clearly what this is and what it isn't. And I'm still asking because I think what it is matters more than what it isn't." He looked at her squarely. "And I think you're the kind of person who believes that too. Otherwise, you'd have given Hale a different answer." She stood in the late March light with the cold still in the air and the mountains behind the ranch going pale blue in the afternoon. And she looked at this man who could not quite stop fidgeting with his hat, and who had said, "I don't have much to offer," as though he didn't know that what he had just said was itself the offer. The honesty of it, the specific clear-eyed refusal to dress it up into something it wasn't. "Yes," she said. He went still. "Yeah? Yes," she said again. "I'll be your wife." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that he was checking, the way people do when something they wanted arrives, and some part of them doesn't quite trust it. Then something settled in him, the same settling she had seen in February, but deeper this time. "Okay," he said, simply, like the final piece of something complicated clicking into its correct position. "Okay." They stood at the fence for another moment. Neither of them moved to do anything dramatic, because neither of them was built for dramatic, and also because Eli had appeared in the window of the house at approximately the moment Colton said the first word and had been watching with badly concealed intensity ever since. "Your son," she said, "has been watching this entire conversation from the kitchen window." Colton turned and looked. Eli, caught, disappeared instantly behind the curtain. "He asked me last week if I was going to ask you," Colton said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was none of his business." "And?" "He said it was specifically his business because you were the only adult who could explain fractions in a way that made sense to him." He paused. "I thought that was probably a yes in disguise." She laughed. Actually laughed. The real kind, not the careful, socially appropriate kind she had been producing for months. It surprised her. It surprised him too, from the look on his face, and then something in him opened up a fraction, just briefly, and he almost smiled the way he almost smiled in the general store all those months ago, except this time it arrived. They told the children together that same afternoon. Eli received the information with the composed satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed by experimentation. "I knew," he said. He managed to make those 2 words carry an extraordinary quantity of smugness. "You didn't know," his father said. "I strongly suspected," Eli amended, "which is almost knowing." Clara said nothing for a moment. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around her cup and looked at Adeline with those serious, measuring eyes that always seemed to be going several layers deeper than the surface of whatever was happening. Adeline held the look without deflecting it, because Clara deserved that. The full, honest eye contact of someone who was not going to pretend that this was simple. "Will you live here?" Clara asked. "At the ranch?" "Yes," Adeline said. "All the time?" "All the time." Clara turned her cup slightly in her hands. My mother's things are still here. Some of them. Pa didn't move all of them. I know, Adeline said. I've noticed. Is that all right? It's more than all right. She said it carefully because she wanted to get it right. Your mother was here a long time before me. This was her home first. I'm not going to come in here and pretend that isn't true. Clara looked at her steadily. What if I miss her and you're there? Then you miss her, Adeline said. That's allowed. That doesn't go away because I'm here, and I'm not going to act like it should. The kitchen was very quiet. Eli, for once in his life, was not talking. Clara got up from her chair and came around the table and pressed her small self against Adeline's side, not hugging exactly. Clara did not hug easily, Adeline had learned, just leaning. The particular weight of a child who has decided something and is acting on the decision before she can reconsider. Adeline put her arm around her and left it there. Colton across the table was looking at his daughter with an expression she had no word for. It was the look of a man watching his child do something brave. They married in December, just before the year turned. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted one, and Silver Creek would have understood either way. The ceremony was at the judge's office rather than any formal venue. Mrs. Halverson attended. Mrs. Pettig attended and shook Adeline's hand afterward in a grip that communicated more than the handshake of someone merely pleased. Eli wore a shirt with a collar that he hated and said so clearly and at length, and then stopped complaining about it once the actual proceedings began, and stood very straight beside his father with the look of a boy who understands that certain occasions require something of you. Clara had asked 2 weeks before the wedding if she could give Adeline something. She had presented with great seriousness a small pressed flower, dried and slightly crumbled, kept between the pages of the notebook she always carried. Mama planted these, she said, at the back of the house. They come back every year. I thought you should have one. Adeline had taken it and held it with the care it deserved, and not said anything immediately, because immediately she would have said something she couldn't recover from in front of a 9-year-old who needed her to be steady. Thank you, she said finally. I'll keep it. She kept it in the cover of her mother's book, next to the letter she had written to herself in November and never sent. The letter with the list of things she wanted and was afraid of and had begun, against all intentions, to hope for. The dried flower and the letter in the same book, which seemed right. The real work began the week after the wedding, and it was harder than either of them had led on to the other beforehand. Not between them, or not only. It was the practical work of two people learning how to occupy the same space, the same decisions, the same daily weight. Colton had been making every choice alone for 2 years, and he was accustomed to the solitude of that in ways he wasn't always aware of. She would suggest something, a different arrangement in the kitchen, a change to how the accounts were kept, and he would listen and then sometimes do it and sometimes not, and she had to learn the difference between the times he'd heard her and decided differently, and the times he simply needed longer. You didn't change the account book, she said one evening after supper when the children were in bed. Not an accusation, just noting. I'm doing it different than you said, he said. He was at the table working through the figures. But I heard what you said about the column order. I moved the debt figures to the front, makes it harder to look at, but easier to think straight. She looked at the book. He had in fact done exactly what she'd suggested, just arranged it in a way she hadn't anticipated. Okay, she said. That's better, actually. I thought so, he said, without emphasis. She sat down across from him and they went through the figures together, for the first time. Not because she insisted on it, but because he set the book in the middle of the table rather than keeping it on his side, which was his way of saying, this is both of ours now. The debt was real. The spring was still the spring's to decide, but the number of hands working the problem had doubled, and she had discovered, through the fall and winter of learning this ranch, that she had a better head for certain numbers than he did, and he had the judgment of someone who had been reading the land for years. And together the picture was clearer than either one managed alone. If the herd does well in spring, she said, following the column with her finger, and the price holds at what Whitfield got last year. It should, he said. Market's been steady. Then you clear this by October. He looked at where her finger was. Yeah. A pause. We clear it. She looked up. He was looking at the word we in the way he looked at things that mattered, carefully, like he was making sure it was real. We clear it, she agreed. The wood stove was running unevenly, as it always did. She had been in this house long enough now to know its patterns, which ones corrected themselves, and which ones needed attention. She got up and adjusted the damper without being asked, and it evened out, and she sat back down, and they went on working through the numbers together in the quiet of the house while the December wind did its work outside. It was not romantic. It was not the version of a life she had imagined once in a different time. It was a man and a woman at a kitchen table going over debt figures by lamplight, while two children slept down the hall in a house with a cracked window and an uneven stove, in a town that had taken months to decide what to make of her and had not entirely finished deciding. And it was, she had found, against all odds, against all the evidence of the years she had just lived through, exactly enough. Not because it was everything, but because it was real, all the way through, with no part of it false. And she had learned, the hard way and slowly, that real was the only kind of thing worth building on. She went to bed that night in a room that was hers, not a hotel room, not a room borrowed from someone else's patients, and lay listening to the wind and the occasional settling of the house, which had its own sounds, its own particular language she was still learning. Colton was already asleep. He slept the way he did most things, directly, without ceremony, out before she finished her own thoughts. She lay beside him in the dark and thought about 43 cents in a dead man's grave, and 5 months that had taken her from the edge of nothing to this bed, in this house, with this man and his children and his debt and his garden and his specific, difficult, invaluable honesty. She thought about her mother, who had told her, "When everything feels like falling, at least breathe like you're standing." She was standing. She was more than standing. She was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she had chosen to be. Not where she'd ended up, not where circumstance had deposited her, but where she had walked to deliberately, with her eyes open, past every easier option. The wind worked at the window. The house settled. Down the hall, one of the children moved in sleep. She thought Clara, from the direction of the sound. She closed her eyes. Outside, the ground was still frozen. But March was not as far away as December made it feel, and somewhere beneath the frozen surface of the garden, the soil that had always been good was waiting, the same way it had been waiting for 2 years, patient in the way only ground can be, ready for whatever was finally coming. The ground thawed on a Tuesday in late March, which nobody announced and nobody celebrated because that was not the kind of thing Silver Creek made ceremony out of. It simply happened, the frost releasing its grip on the topsoil the way a fist unclenches after a long cold night, slowly and by degrees, until one morning Adeline walked to the back of the house and pressed her boot into the earth of the garden and felt it give instead of resist. She stood there for a moment alone in the early light before the house was fully awake. The garden looked like it had looked all winter, bare, unremarkable, the old post stakes still marking its edges like the outline of something that had once been deliberate. But underneath that sameness, everything had changed. The soil was workable now. The season had turned and the work could begin, and she felt the specific weight of that in her chest. Not the lightness of relief, but the heavier, more honest feeling of something real about to be demanded of her. She went inside and started breakfast. Colton came in from the barn while she was at the stove, the way he did every morning. Cold from the outside air, moving quietly so as not to wake the children, hat already off before he cleared the doorway. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the back of the property with the expression of a man who is taking stock. "Ground's soft," he said. "I know, I checked." He looked at her sideways. "Early." "I was awake," she said. She handed him a plate, and he took it and sat down, and they ate in the comfortable silence that married people build over time. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have stopped needing to fill every space with words. Eli came down first, as he always did. He had his father's internal clock and was constitutionally unable to stay in bed past 6, regardless of the season. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hair going in 4 directions and assessed the morning with the efficiency of a 9-year-old who considers himself a practical person. "Are we starting the garden today?" he asked. "When did you become part of this?" his father said. "I've always been part of this," Eli said, with complete sincerity. He sat down and reached for the bread. "Clara will want to plant the flowers by the east fence, she told me." "Clara can tell me herself," Adeline said. "She will. She's been thinking about it for 2 weeks. She just hasn't said it yet." He buttered his bread with the focused competence of a child who takes simple tasks seriously. She thinks if she asks, and then it doesn't work, she'll feel worse than if she didn't ask. The kitchen went briefly quiet. Colton looked at his son with the look he sometimes had. The one that said the boy had just said something that cut closer to the truth than expected. She gets that from someone, Adeline said carefully. Colton picked up his cup. Don't look at me. I'm looking directly at you. Eli watched this exchange with the satisfaction of a person at a tennis match. Clara came down 20 minutes later, doll under one arm and notebook under the other, and ate her breakfast with her usual self-contained quiet. She was 10 now, had turned 10 in February, which they had marked with a small cake that Adeline had made and that Eli had eaten a disproportionate amount of while explaining that he was quality testing it. She sat at the table and looked out the window at the back of the property, and Adeline watched her look without saying anything. Finally, Clara said, "Could I plant something by the east fence?" "Yes," Adeline said. "What did you want to plant?" Clara opened the notebook to a page that had clearly been prepared in advance. She had drawn something there, a rough layout, the kind of plan a careful child makes when they've been thinking about something for a while. "Mama's flowers were in the middle section," she said. "I remember where. I think they'll come back on their own. They always did." She pointed to the east edge of her drawing. "I want to put something different here, something that's mine." She looked up. "Is that all right?" "It's your garden too," Adeline said. "But it was her garden first." "It was," Adeline said. "And it can be hers and yours and all of ours at the same time. A garden isn't like a room. Things don't crowd each other out just by existing." Clara looked at the drawing for a moment, then at Adeline. "You're not just saying that." "No," Adeline said. "I'm not just saying that." Clara nodded, satisfied in the way she was satisfied by things that were straightforwardly true, and went back to her breakfast. They started the garden that weekend, all four of them, which was chaotic in the particular way of family projects where everyone has a different pace and a different idea, and the overall vision keeps getting interrupted by the immediate reality. Colton worked the larger section with the methodical steadiness he brought to all physical work, breaking the winter-compacted soil, turning it over, doing the thing that needed doing without complaint or commentary. Eli helped him and asked questions constantly, a running interrogation about soil composition and drainage, and whether worms were a good sign that he eventually needed Colton to tell him to either work or talk, but not simultaneously. Clara planted her section with the seriousness of a surgeon. She had done her research, had found a seed catalog in town, and spent several evenings studying it with the focused intensity she usually brought to her reading lessons. And she had a plan, and she was executing it, and did not want assistance. Thank you, she was fine. Adeline worked the center section, the section where Ruth's flowers had grown. She had thought about this, had thought about it carefully, lying awake in the dark weeks before the ground thawed, going through it from different angles the way you do with things that matter enough to get wrong. She was not trying to preserve something that wasn't hers to preserve, and she was not trying to erase it either. She was trying to tend it. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. The early shoots were already there when she cleared the winter debris away, just visible, the first green pressing up through the dark soil in the places where Ruth had planted years ago. Perennials coming back the way perennials do, without being asked, because that's their nature. She worked around them carefully, added to what was there, things she had chosen herself, seeds she had ordered from the same catalog Clara found, colors and varieties that she liked and that she thought might work alongside what was already growing, not replacing, adding. The way you add yourself to a story that was already in motion, not starting it over, just continuing it from where it actually was. She was on her knees in the dirt when Colton came to stand beside her. He looked at what she was doing for a moment, and she thought he understood what she was doing and why. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, not to fill silence, not to be generous, just as a fact. Adeline sat back on her heels and looked at the shoots coming up through the dark soil. What was she like? He crouched down beside her, forearms on his knees. "Practical," he said. "More practical than me, which took some getting used to." A slight pause. She had opinions about everything, and she didn't hide them. Eli gets that straight from her. He looked at the center section of the garden. She planted this the first spring. Said there was no point waiting until things were settled because things were never going to be settled. You might as well plant the flowers. Adeline smiled. She sounds like she was right about that. She was right about most things. He was quiet for a moment. She would have said something direct and probably slightly embarrassing about you and me, and she would have been right about that too. What would she have said? He thought about it. Probably that I was too slow getting here and I should have said something 3 months earlier. She would have been right. Yeah. He almost smiled. She usually was. They knelt together in the garden for a while, working side by side with the comfortable practicality of two people who have gotten past performing and are just doing the thing. Eli's voice carried from the other end of the garden. He had switched to a lecture about earthworms that his father was no longer required to respond to because it had become largely self-sustaining. Clara worked in focused silence, pressing seeds into the earth with deliberate care. May arrived with the sudden generosity that follows a long winter, warmth that felt like an apology, days that stretched out longer than you'd remembered they could. The ranch came alive with the particular energy of a place that has survived another year of difficulty and is now being reminded what it's capable of. The herd had come through winter better than they dared to expect. Colton didn't say much about his relief. He was not a man who expressed relief expansively, but she knew it by the change in his shoulders, a certain tension that had been there since she first met him, finally releasing sometime in April when the count came back clean. She had kept the accounts through all of it, not because she'd taken over. She was careful about that, careful not to make him feel displaced from something that had been his to manage, but because they had settled into a division that made sense. He read the land, she read the numbers, and between the two of them they could see the whole picture. The debt was clearing, not gone, not yet, but by summer it would be something they could clear their hands of, and that changed the feel of everything. The town had shifted around them in the way towns shift around couples who make their decision and stick to it. The speculation dried up once there was nothing left to speculate about, and in its place came a kind of matter-of-fact acknowledgement. She was Adeline Briggs now. She worked the ranch accounts, and she could occasionally be found at the laundry, not working but talking with Mrs. Pedig, who had become the closest thing she had to an old friend in this place. She sat on the church steps with Clara, while Clara fed crumbs to a bird that had decided to trust her incrementally over the course of 3 weeks. She argued with Eli about mathematics, which he had begun doing deliberately because he had discovered she pushed back and he liked the challenge. Margaret Fowler spoke to her at the general store one morning in April. It was brief and slightly awkward and more honest than their previous conversation had been. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said. She said it like a person who had been working up to it and had decided to simply do it before the preparation became a reason to delay indefinitely. "You don't," Adeline said. "I said something that wasn't fair, about taking advantage." She looked directly at her. "I could see you were good with them. I just didn't want to see it." "I understood why you said it. It was still wrong." Adeline looked at her for a moment. She thought about the woman who had stood in the laundry and told her the truth about her own fear. "I don't want you to let them get attached to someone who might leave," and how that truth had been delivered unkindly but had not been inaccurate, and how she had answered it the only way she could, which was by staying. "We're fine," Adeline said. And then, because she meant it, "Those children are lucky to have people in this town who look out for them." Margaret absorbed this, nodded once, moved on. It was not a friendship, but it was the end of an unnecessary war, and in a town this size, that was worth something. The summer was hard work, which meant it was the same as everything else. The ranch did not transform overnight into something prosperous and uncomplicated. The fence that had failed in winter failed again in June and cost them 3 days to repair properly. There was a week in July when one of the horses came up lame, and Colton barely slept for 4 nights running, going out to check on it with the grim focus of someone who cannot afford to lose what they're watching. The horse recovered. The fence held after the second repair. The numbers at the end of each month were better than the month before, incrementally, honestly, without drama. Eli turned 10 in August and announced at breakfast that he had decided to become either an engineer or a naturalist, and possibly both. Clara, who was reading at a level that had quietly begun to alarm the school teacher in the best possible way, said nothing about Eli's announcement for a moment, and then said, "You should decide what it actually is before you tell everyone." Announcing the direction is the first step, Eli said. That's not how steps work, Clara said. This argument occupied them for the better part of breakfast and required no adult intervention. Colton caught Adeline's eye across the table, and she saw in his face what she had come to recognize over these months. The look of a man who is watching his life and recognizing it as his, with all of its imperfection and noise and competing voices and busted fences, and finding that enough. More than enough. The banknote cleared in September. Colton came home from town on a Wednesday afternoon and set the paper on the kitchen table without ceremony. She looked at it and looked at him. Done, he said. She picked up the paper and read it and set it down again. 2 years of carrying that weight, for him, 3, counting the seasons before she arrived, and now it was just a piece of paper on a kitchen table in the afternoon light. We should do something, she said. Mark it. Like what? I don't know, something. He thought about this. I'll make dinner, he said. The good one. The one Eli likes. That's what you're going with. The children will be happy. You'll be fed. The note is paid. He shrugged, but there was something in it that was not indifferent. That seems like enough. She looked at him. You know, most people would want to make more of a moment out of that. I made a moment out of it in April when the count came back clean, he said. I just didn't tell anyone. You sat with it alone, she said. I did. A pause. And then I went and told you the numbers were going to be fine, and you already knew because you'd done the math 3 weeks earlier. I didn't want to say anything until you'd had a chance to see it yourself. He looked at her steadily. I know. He picked up the paper and folded it and put it in the drawer where they kept the accounts. That's why I married you. She laughed because it was such a Colton Briggs reason. Completely practical and completely true at the same time, with the warmth hidden inside the practicality for anyone willing to look. He made the dinner. The children were happy. It was a regular Wednesday evening, distinguished from other Wednesday evenings only by the absence of a weight that had been there so long they had stopped noticing how it changed the air swung. In October, Adeline found Clara sitting by the east fence of the garden in the afternoon, looking at what had grown there over the summer. Clara's flowers had come in, not perfectly, some of them, because gardening on a first attempt rarely goes perfectly, but enough. Colors she had chosen herself, growing in the earth she had prepared herself, doing what they were going to do regardless of how carefully she'd planned. Adeline sat beside her on the ground without being invited, and Clara allowed it the way she allowed most things from Adeline now, easily, without needing to make a decision out of it. They did okay, Clara said. Better than okay. The ones by the second stake didn't come in right, she pointed. I don't know why. The drainage is worse there. We can fix it next spring. Clara nodded, was quiet for a moment, then, Mama's flowers came back. They always will, Adeline said. That's the thing about what she planted. It doesn't need us to keep it going. Clara thought about this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. But we can still take care of it. We can, Adeline said. We should. They sat in the October afternoon with the light going golden the way it does in fall in that country. Slanted and generous, the kind that makes everything look like it has been considered carefully before being lit. The mountains were already showing their winter on the upper elevations. The apple tree at the corner of the property, an old one, planted years before the Briggs family arrived, by someone whose name no one remembered anymore, was heavy with fruit that needed picking before the first frost. Eli came around the side of the house at speed, slowed when he saw them sitting, and came to stand nearby with the slightly deflated energy of someone who had been going somewhere and is now reconsidering. What are you doing? He asked. Sitting, Clara said. Why? Because we can, Adeline said. Eli considered this and then, with the pragmatism of a 10-year-old who has decided to accept an unexplained situation, sat down on the other side of Adeline. The three of them sat by the east fence in the October light and said nothing for a while, which was its own kind of language. Colton came out of the barn and crossed the yard and saw them and stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking at the three of them sitting in the grass by the garden, and Adeline could not see his face clearly from that distance, but she knew his posture, had learned it over a year of watching. She could read him by the set of his shoulders the way you learn to read weather. He walked over and sat down on the ground beside her without asking what they were doing or why, because he had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that sometimes you don't ask. Sometimes you just sit down where the people you love are sitting, and that is the whole thing. That is all there is to it. The apple tree dropped a fruit somewhere near the fence with a soft sound. The mountains held their position. The garden that had been neglected for 2 years and was now tended by 4 sets of hands in different ways, carefully, roughly, scientifically, gently, sat in the afternoon light doing what gardens do when they are cared for, which is simply grow. There was nothing resolved about them, not entirely. Colton still went quiet when things were hard in a way that she still sometimes had to learn to navigate. Eli still argued for the sake of arguing and sometimes needed to be told that being right and being kind were not mutually exclusive. Claire still woke some nights and needed a few minutes of sitting with someone before she could go back to sleep. And Adeline was the one who got up. And she did it without resentment because she understood the particular arithmetic of a child's grief, which does not resolve, only changes shape over time. And Adeline herself, she still felt the pull of Philadelphia sometimes, the ghost of a life she had not chosen. Still had moments in the winter when the cold and the isolation stacked up, and she had to remind herself deliberately of all the reasons she was here. She was not made of stone, and this was not easy, and she had never pretended otherwise, not even to herself. But she was here, by choice, past every alternative, through every doubt, on the other side of a year that had taken more from her than she'd had to give, and had given back more than she had thought to ask for. She had arrived in Silver Creek with 43 cents and the name of a dead man. She had found instead a frozen garden and 2 children who gave her a doll to hold and a man who turned back instead of walking away. She had found Mrs. Pettig, who raised her pay without explanation and once told her, "You know what you're doing," in a tone that made it sound like a fact rather than encouragement. She had found a hotel room in a town that watched her, and she had stayed long enough that the watching became something else, recognition, which is what respect looks like before it admits to itself what it is. She had built something here. It was not finished. It would probably never be entirely finished, because the things worth building never are. They just keep requiring your attention, your effort, your willingness to show up on the days when you don't feel like it, and work alongside the people who are counting on you to be there. That was what nobody told you about the frontier. Not the cold or the distance or the physical hardship, though all of that was real. What nobody told you was that survival was not the end of the story. Survival was just when the real story started. After you had gotten through the worst of it and could stand up straight again, the question that remained was, now what will you build, and who will you build it with, and will you have the courage to choose that building deliberately instead of just drifting into whatever was offered? She had chosen, with her eyes open, past every easier door. The afternoon light moved across the garden